Are you doing Mondays? Watercolor workshop?
Mondays?
Monday.
You're going to be there?
Yeah.
Me too.
5 hours, right?
I'm only going to be there to help organize.
Yeah.
Not to, hey.
You've traveled with her, right?
Oh yeah, we went to Maine twice. Lovely, lovely. I highly recommend trips with her. She's doing something in May, local. At a farm somewhere in the valley, I think.
Yeah.
You might look at her website. I'm sure she'll talk about it if there's vacancies. She fills up very quickly. Phyllis is another member of the club. Are you going Monday too? It should be great. Should be good. I'm going to be there, but I gave up my spot. Because I've been at that for all day, right? I had like 2 meetings. It should be good. Well, then I try to tell that to Linda. But come at 9:30, help set up. A workshop, an art workshop. We bring somebody in. We bring the woman I think we have. She don't come out, so she's like 25. Bring her out. What age do you think? Oh, yeah, I have talked to them. Oh my gosh, that's so crazy. Yeah. From Bel Air. One was a cover. Yeah. Yeah. And at that time, when I was yes.
We have 2 seats up here if anybody wants to come up. $50 each. Come on. Come
All right, folks, we are going to get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, hands in the back. Can you hear me okay back there? Wonderful. Okay, hello. Welcome to New Dominion Bookshop. My name is Hodges, and I'm the event host here. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start by thanking both the Virginia Festival of the Book. The fund is in honor of Carol Troxwell, who is a former bookseller and owner of the shop, and it is through the continued support of that fund and the Virginia Festival that we are able to hold this event. And so we are thrilled to have a quick round of applause. As a brief introduction, O'Rourke's new book, The Invisible Kingdom, State of Long-Term Maladies. According to the Boston Globe, the book is essential. The New York Times called it an authentically original perspective, and Publishers Weekly named it as one of the best books of 2022, regardless of genre. O'Rourke is also a renowned poet and essayist, author of The Long Goodbye and the poem to Megan O'Rourke.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here on this cozy, rainy day. I love Charlottesville. This is such a wonderful place. I have this habit of wherever I travel, I imagine myself living there. And sometimes I'm happy to let go of that fantasy, but I'm not happy to let go of the fantasy of this place. It's a really special place. So thank you all for coming out. I can't see you all, but hopefully everyone can hear me in the back. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah, okay. A little bit from my most recent book of poems, Sun and Days. Both books take up I have this problem as a writer. I seem to need to write whatever I'm obsessed by in two genres. So I find that I have to write out of a kind of problem that's preoccupying me, and that problem could be an aesthetic problem, it could be a biographical problem that also seems like a potentially a literary one, and it always seems to be the case that I have to write it in the form of poetry and in the form of prose, which is a little in prose. So The Invisible Kingdom, which is my most recent book, the memoir, it's actually a hybrid, what I think of as a hybrid book. It blends a personal story, which is the story of my getting mysteriously sick without any answers, an experience I lived with for more than 15 years before getting a diagnosis, if you can believe that. With research and reporting, I'm also trained as a journalist, into why what I call poorly understood illnesses that are often invisible and often go unrecognized. So in other words, the autobiographical problem I was having, I quickly realized was a kind of social problem, that millions of people were sick and having trouble getting diagnosis, which is actually somewhat strange in this hyper-diagnostic age. And if you guys any of you were at the event last night, you'll know that I say my son was recently diagnosed with sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia, which sounds quite terrifying. It's an ice cream headache. So he quite easily got that diagnosis, but meanwhile, I was very, very sick and struggled for more than a decade to get any kind of diagnosis. And in my reporting, this book grew out of the question of, was that unusual or was that common? And I interviewed and spoke to more than 100 people living with illness and found that this was in fact quite common. That many people with autoimmune diseases, with poorly understood conditions like myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome, and now even long COVID, were struggling to get diagnoses and were often told within a year of their quite clear-cut test results for something that perhaps they were just hypochondriacs, perhaps they were suffering primarily from anxiety. Autoimmune diseases are experienced predominantly by women. And so one of the things I investigate in the book is the ways in which women's testimony is often taken as unreliable. But this is true for men too. Men were just going to the doctor later on when they were much sicker and meeting similar kinds of problems of having an illness that doesn't fit known descriptors. And so in the book, I'm really exploring that lived experience of being at the edge of language. And that's why I wanted to write about it, right? Because I realized that this biographical experience that I was having was actually a kind of cultural literary problem, which is to say, we have language and we tell stories, as Joan Didion said, in order to live. And I think part of what she meant is that frameworks and language mean we don't have to explain every single aspect of our experience to one another all the time. I mean, the analogy I sometimes use is, imagine that you fell in romantic love for the first time and you had never read about it or heard the term love. You would be like, what is happening to me? How do I explain? And people around you would be like, what's wrong with that? They're behaving so strangely. But we have stories of love. We have the idea of love. We have a whole history of love to help us, right? To make us feel connected through that experience. And so in some ways, The Invisible Kingdom is my attempt to write a kind of illness narrative that I don't think really exists in our literature. And that is the narrative of chronicity of chronic illness, of living in a body that you know is not working properly, and knowing that it's not going to get better in the traditional sense. So I'm going to read a few pages from actually the last chapter, which is called The Wisdom Narrative. As you'll hear from it, I'm really interested in this book and the stories that we tell about illness. And the reason for that is that the stories we tell, as I just indicated, materially affect our experience. And it seemed to me, I have to tell you the truth, when I was writing this book up in my attic room, I thought, God, who is going to want to read this book about an illness that doesn't go away? It's got no real drama. My husband kept saying, well, what's going to happen? You just keep staying sick. I was like, I know. One day I came downstairs and I was like, I finally know what my book is about. He said, what? I said, uncertainty. I don't know if that's going to do so well. So the point being that I really, there were moments of great doubt writing this book of what am I adding? What is the value of it? But the more I thought about it, the more I just thought so many of us, either personally or through someone we love, is going to be touched by this experience of an illness or a physical malady that we don't quite understand and that we have to accommodate ourselves to. And looking at the stories we tell or don't tell in that moment is actually something I feel quite impassioned to do, both in poetry and in prose. So I actually cheated on this book while I was writing it to write Sun in Days. And that was because I felt that the pressure of narrative was almost too tidy and too, I was in the midst of an experience I didn't understand. And so to write a researched book about it felt fraudulent somehow, right? So I stopped and I wrote Sun in Days. And I'll read you a couple of poems from there. And in Sun in Days, there's quite a lot of fracture and space and silence. And the line break operates, I think, as a kind of abyss, a kind of pause, a kind of rupture, a space of uncertainty that allowed me to figure out how to write about this illness in a way that felt authentic. And that experience of allowing fracture and silence and what couldn't be answered or understood through music allowed me to go back to this book and write it in a way that felt authentic to me. So I'm just going to read a couple pages from the last chapter, which is me thinking about this question of what does illness leave us with? What does it give us, if anything? And what kinds of stories do we tell about it as a culture? So this is called The Wisdom Narrative. The stories that we tell about illness are almost entirely about overcoming it. But for illnesses that cannot be overcome, they are about growing wiser as a result of suffering. During my illness, I kept finding that others wanted to assuage my pain by reassuring me of the good things it had brought with it. They had embraced the reassurances of a cultural narrative in which the ravages of illness are offset by the enlightening spiritual knowledge they bring with them, a narrative in which sickness is bearable because it transforms the sufferer. One spring, when I was at my most ill, a friend visited me at my apartment in Brooklyn, and drinking herbal tea beside me on the couch where I spent most of my days, earnestly brought up all the things my illness had taught me. Surely, she said, such lessons were worthwhile. I bridled, then snapped. I would prefer not to have learned any of them this way, to be honest. In the American pop spiritual approach, illness is a vehicle for self-improvement and hard-won acceptance. A line of thinking the sick patient quickly finds is everywhere. It shows up in Alice in Bed, Susan Sontag's play about the chronically ill Alice James. Alice James was the sister of Henry James and William James. She was sick her whole life with what was diagnosed as hysteria. And eventually she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so happy was she to have a diagnosis that she said, finally, I am so glad I embraced this diagnosis, which of course is quite tragic. At one point in the play, a friend blithely encourages Alice, who is at that moment extremely sick, to just want what you are capable of and shrug off the rest. Life is not just a question of courage, Alice tartly replies. In the illness narratives, the anthropologist Arthur Kleinman praises patients who are able to handle their illness with grace. Onlookers often respond to the experience of chronically ill people by focusing on the supposed positives, presumably because it makes the pain of witness bearable. And of course, the notion of illness as a vehicle for spiritual change has its roots in a Judeo-Christian tradition that emphasizes the instructive, even sacramental, value of human pain. It is true that illness is an experience that tests you and forces you to rebuild your life. The destruction it wreaks can make room for recreation. As Arthur Frank puts it in his book, The Wounded Storyteller, unmaking can be a generative process. What is unmade stands to be remade. But I had read too many letters and diaries written by suffering people to feel sanguine about healthy friends focusing on the, quote, spiritual growth illness brings with it. There is a razor-thin line between trying to find something usefully redemptive in illness and lying to ourselves about the nature of suffering. Until we mourn what is lost in illness, and until we have a medical community that takes seriously the suffering of patients, we should not celebrate what is gained in it. At various points, when I was most ill and as I began to recover, I wrestled with whether anything good could be said to come out of chronic illness. Does illness bring wisdom? What does it mean to suffer? To answer that, we need to understand in a deep way the types of stories we tell ourselves about illness, and to accept that the meaning of any given illness is unstable, indeterminate, and different from person to person. I got sick, I got worse, I got better. That's how the standard illness narrative goes. But just as I am unable to pinpoint exactly how or when my illness started, I cannot say that it ended. My narrative is not a neat one. Which version of the story of my illness I tell depends on what month, what day, even what hour I do so, and whether my symptoms are in the foreground or the background. I am luckier than I thought I would be when I got acutely sick in 2012. After years of suffering, being treated for a tick-borne illness got me partly better, transforming me from a bedridden person who could not recall basic words like spring to a functioning and energetic 38-year-old. I have recovered, and yet, though I try not to focus on it, I am still sick. I live with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, POTS, and an autoimmune disease. I have ongoing fatigue, brain fog, and neurological and connective tissue problems. They're mostly manageable. Sometimes they are not. One recent morning, I woke feeling unwell. Sharp electric shocks ran along my legs and arms. I stood by the sink, unable to do the dishes, in pain. My older son looked up from eating his breakfast and said, "What's wrong, Mommy?" At 4, he has already learned that sometimes I am unwell, despite my best efforts to hide it. It hurts me that he worries for me. It is difficult to look at the shadows of physical suffering clearly, because to do so, I know, is to risk inviting depression or a terrifying apprehension that the world is made of pain. But when I was at my sickest, I resolved that if I got well enough to write about my experience, I would not give false assurances. I would not write letters reassuring those I loved that my life had not been utterly compromised. Now that I am better, somewhat better, I can tell you the truth. When I was at my sickest, my life was utterly compromised, and my very sense of self was gone. When I was less sick, and there were many periods of relief in my illness, I could step back from the experience and take pleasure in the vividness of the blue sky from my bedroom window. But I will not repeat falsehoods. I will not say the wisdom and growth mean I wouldn't have it any other way. I would have it the other way. I'll read just one more little section here. Being ill is a social experience, as the poet John Donne realized. He's the one who wrote "No man is an island," a phrase we've probably all heard, and I hadn't known this till I read my book, but he wrote that passage from basically something called Devotions in an Emergency while he was sick in bed during a pandemic and thought he was going to die of spotted fever, and he was quite worried about his oldest daughter. I think it was his daughter, let's say, who was engaged to be married, but not yet married. And so he said, "I want you to be married while I'm sick. I don't know if I'm going to live." And she agreed to be married that weekend. And so he lay in his hospital bed listening for church bells. And of course, as he was sitting there listening for church bells, feeling acutely alone, he also heard the bells of people who had died, right? The funeral bells. And that's what led him to write this famous passage, that he realized, as alone as I am, I'm deeply interconnected. I'm sitting here listening for the news of death and life, birth and loss, and it led him to write, "No man is an island, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Right? So, being ill is a social experience, as John Donne realized. It is what the sociologist Arthur Frank calls dyadic, impossible to understand without thinking about the self in relation to others. Yet Western medical culture insists on the solitariness of illness. Everything about it intensifies the monadic aspect, confining patients to hospitals where anonymity differentiates and isolates, rather than embraces and unifies us in our interconnected humanity. The patient's identity is thwarted, silenced, distorted in a culture that does not recognize itself in its sick members. One of the most important discoveries I made in the process of being ill is that solitary striving, my American habit of self-focus, was in some fundamental way a degradation of the most powerful aspects of our lives, which now seemed to me to be our interconnectedness and need of others. I look at my small sons and I see that they need me, and in that I see what is most meaningful in the end, not children specifically, but the bonds among us. I wrote all this while staying in Massachusetts at the end of a late winter snowstorm that would make the week the snowiest in New England history. In the vast quiet, small sounds stood out, announcing themselves as the record of an already vanishing present. A black ice coated the sidewalks. In the afternoon, men dressed in puffy white coats resembling hazmat suits shoveled the snow and walked among the drifts, pushing against the whiteout that would soon cover even the parking meters. I found myself thinking of James Joyce's story, The Dead, which ends with a languorous vision of a world covered by snow. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, but falling obliquely against the lamplight. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, upon all the living and the dead. The lintels of the windows were dusted in white, the whole world quiet except for the thrum of snowplows, the beep-beep of trucks backing up, the sounds of our present lives. I slipped into a deep calm, thinking of the living and the dead intertwined, all together beneath the flakes and the dirt of the world. It was a painful calm, a sense of how little control we have over the course of our lives, and an understanding that the deepest meanings come from our contact with that portal between control and submission. This was not necessarily an expansive vision, but in its accuracy it was, for the moment, soothing. As the poet Audre Lorde put it, of living with breast cancer, my visions of a future I can create have been honed by the lessons of my limitations. I was also aware that I felt this way largely because I was not as sick as I had been. When I was at my sickest, there was little room for understanding, only for discomfort. My illness changed me, and as a result, I know more about embodiment than I used to, and some part of me is proud of that knowledge, which I raise to my lips like a bitter seed now and then, just to remember how it truly is, what this life really is about behind the facade of daily pretense, new cars, school sing-alongs, seasonal decorations, emails piling up unanswered, bills to pay, and the sweet hugs of my children with their plump limbs and fluffy snowsuits. And I think what I'll do is just read one or two poems from Sun and Days, so you can hear sort of this same material, but doing it in a really different way. I'll read two poems and one very, very short one, and then we'll talk. This is a poem called What It Was Like, and as you can hear from the vagueness of the title, I was trying to get at. This was a poem written before I had any kind of diagnosis, so I was just living with illness and trying to talk about what it was like to be sick while you want to not be sick, what it was like. Your green mind is an ocean you can't enter, sleeping in the bed hours each day. Blurry figures move in the rooms around you. Someone cooks a Christmas feast. Another buys complicated, precise plastic goods, distributes them around the house. The past opens into a lamp, a bee colony, a book about mitochondria under attack. You want to be alone in the deep, the spiky sea urchins drifting along the floor, the fish starting and shivering, the reef fading. Instead, you're like the dead in deadpan. In the subway, the billboards ask, did I really die? The snow on the sidewalk graying, the buckets of footsteps gone. You keep saying, this is my hand, it hurts, please take it away. Hating and wanting in equal measure, jealous of the other's human time, the way their bodies work, cells dividing, cytokines quiet. Not yours. You stare at the ceiling, eating superfoods, taking pills, rubbing your liver with castor oil, spooning down maca and nettles. Notebook pages scrawled with the facts, the what went wrong and how, the police searchlight squall of pursuit, the verdict always about to be delivered. And there's a lot of writing about how hard it is to write about pain. Elaine Scarry wrote an incredible book called The Body in Pain, in which she said, to have pain is to have certainty, to hear about pain is to have uncertainty, right? That hearing about pain, it's so different from having it. We don't have a lot of language for pain that's very precise. So the next two poems are about trying to write about pain through poetry, which is always a way of writing around as a way of trying to get to, I think. Human-sized pain. It was a me I couldn't let go of, in Sauconys and sweat-wicking shirts, in mules and a miniskirt, in fear, in numbness, virusy, wired, and dumb, and all of a sudden, praying. I shuddered a little like one does in a dream. The pain arrived as if from inside me, reaching out of my marrow into my mind. I tried to act, to alleviate, to assuage, but it didn't get better with time. Time made it worse. To know my pain, you had to want what I wanted, but not have it. You had to watch the years unfurl into yellow leaves without leaving. No, forget the leaves, too poetic. To know it, you had to live without, while those around you lightly had and kept on having. I believed less and less in the future. All that possibility dwindled to a nothing but 4, 5, 6 the months, 4, 5, 6 the years. It was an image in a photograph that kept getting blurrier, even as the resolution grew clearer. It was not like missing the dead or wanting another chance at love. It shimmers on lakes, is especially strong in the summer, clinging to me like a person who can't swim, but wants to be in the water, a thing that will drown me, just to show me who I am. And the last poem I'll read is very short, and it's called Poem Problem, and the problem is in parentheses. I kept trying to put the pain into a poem, but all I did was write the word pain in my notebook over and over. All right, I think maybe I'll stop there so we can talk and see questions.
Thank you so much. It really is lovely to hear about not only the invisible kingdom, but also how that obsession comes into your poetry as well. So much of the invisible kingdom is centered around the care and capacity to recognize that other people are complex beings, also feeling things, sometimes feeling pain that we are either not feeling or also can't even see. So my first question for you is, how are you feeling today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. That's so nice of you to ask. No, I'm as I describe in the book, I was eventually diagnosed with tick-borne illness, which I don't know if you have too much of here. I hope you do. So pernicious. Wish we didn't. I know. Unfortunately, it's going to be more and more places, I think, as ecology changes. But yeah, I was diagnosed with tick-borne illness after 15 years, which is something I still grieve, or almost grieve more now, right? Now that I'm healthy, I realize how much I lost. So I live with illness. I still have an autoimmune disease. I still have something called POTS. I have a lot of, as a friend of mine who's also chronically ill, who's also, she's a scientist and gets a lot done. She's like, we have our hacks, right? So I have a lot of hacks, little life hacks, but I'm able to be here. I'm able to write books. It's a totally different experience because of that diagnosis and the treatment I got. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. And so from the title itself, The Invisible Kingdom, and throughout the book, you kind of grapple with being seen and being not seen, and a desire to be seen and to have illness recognized by others. One of the epigraphs in the book from Susan Sontag kind of talks about the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. And I feel that the book is also studying two kingdoms that are like the literal bodily experience of being ill and also society's understanding of and reaction to illness. So I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of the relationship between those two things, the body and the response that also seem like separate realms and need to not be, perhaps.
It's so nice to have an amazing reader like you describe my book to me. I'm like, oh, yes, you're right. That's what it's about. Thank you. I wish you'd been there in the early days of the struggle. What is this about? No, you've really nailed what I think I'm interested in, which is the title, The Invisible Kingdom, is drawn from that Sontag quote where she says at the beginning of her famous book, Illness as Metaphor, which is about the stories we tell about illnesses we don't understand. She points out that we often psychologize those illnesses. We often say there's something wrong with the person who has that illness, not, oh, we don't understand that illness yet. Mm-hmm. So she starts the book by saying, the fact is we almost all of us are going to have a passport that takes us from the kingdom of the well to the kingdom of the sick. And none of us want to live in the night side of life, but we're going to probably end up there at some point. So I was thinking about how I didn't even have that passport because I didn't even know I was sick at first. I was embarked on this journey where I would go to doctors and say, well, something seems off. I don't feel like my body is like the body of other 20-year-olds. I would just suddenly be exhausted for days on end. And they would say, no, you're probably just anxious or you're working too hard or, how are you sleeping? And I was never sleeping well. So I'm like, well, not so great. And so I really internalized this narrative that maybe I was just anxious or sort of inappropriately focused on my health. In retrospect, that's kind of a tragedy because I was having very extreme symptoms that someone should have paid attention to. So what I try to convey in the book is that as hard and as painful as the suffering of being sick itself was, and you just heard me talk about that a little bit, that was not what almost killed me. What almost killed me was not being seen in my suffering. And I think that the reason for that is very basic but profound, which is that as humans, we are meaning-seeking creatures. And we seek meaning in the recognition of others, even if we're introverts, as I am. It's like at the end of the day, we want to feel that our experience is somehow meaningful. And as I talk about in the book, I quite explicitly remember thinking, if they told me you have an incurable illness and you will never feel better, but we're going to study you, I actually would have found that easier than having slightly less suffering, but never knowing what it was and never having anyone even acknowledge that I was suffering. Because you want to feel that your suffering adds somehow to the great scope of human knowledge and wisdom and being. So I think that's really what the book tries to get is broadly speaking, it's interested in any kind of chronic experience. Specifically, it's quite interested in how many of us undergo something that is poorly understood. Mm-hmm. And then we have to navigate that terrain and we have to build a kind of story about it. And that's what this book is.
Thank you. And the dismissal from doctors, the way that a patient doesn't get seen, doesn't get heard, this happens either because a doctor assumes, the phrase that you use is that someone is one of the worried well, of someone hyper-focused on their own health, even though they're fine, or because of biases around racial identity, gender identity. I know that you mentioned specifically doctors refusing to offer care to folks who are transgender. So it happens for a lot of different reasons, clearly, but it happens kind of across the board, So patients of all different experiences are coming to doctors and being dismissed in this way. What is a patient to do? You mentioned hacks, I think, that are for getting through the day. I'm wondering, are there hacks for getting a doctor to hear you?
Yeah, I get asked this question all the time, and I've realized that my answer may be a depressing one. which is, but I think it's true, which is that I do think fundamentally if a doctor is not hearing you, you just have to move on. I think I spent way too much time sort of trying to get the doctors to hear me. And as I talk about in the book, thinking, okay, if I just tell the right story, right, then I'll get help, right? If I just figure out how to present myself, then I'll get help. And that put everything on me, when in fact, it's really the system that needs to change. And by the way, although I'm quite critical of the medical system, I have tremendous empathy for doctors because they're in a system that is not training them to take care of or have time to even offer empathy for chronically ill patients, right? We're in this medical system where the basic building block of it is the 15-minute appointment through managed care where your insurance won't let your doctor spend more time with you and isn't remunerating them very much for that appointment necessarily and is miring them in bureaucracy. So it's just not a system where you can go and spend an hour with someone really listening to you and asking all the questions that really do need to be asked to uncover the depth and complexity of a multi-systemic illness like the ones that I'm talking about. So I do think the other problem we have, so we have this sort of systemic structural problem. We also have the problem, which is a good thing in many ways, which is that our modern medical system is based on measurement and based on the idea that a lot of bodies behave roughly the same, right? That's how we do randomized controlled trials to look at, is this medication effective? And we decide it is because it is effective for enough people compared to a placebo. But not everyone's bodies behave exactly the same way. And one of the things that we're realizing is that, especially when it comes to what are called immune-mediated illnesses, or illnesses that are really driven by your immune system, it can look really different person to person. So lupus in two different people can manifest in quite different ways. It also, we're getting better at this, but until recently we didn't have great tests to measure for autoimmune diseases. So as the father of autoimmune disease, so-called father of autoimmune disease, Noel Rose, who created the first center in America, told me, he discovered autoimmune disease in the 1950s. He was like, many of our tests only show the presence of disease when the organ that's being attacked by your immune system is already 80% destroyed. And he said to me, and I'll never forget this, by that time, the train's already gone off the track, right? So the good news is there's new tests, they're coming, there's better testing, but the bad news is we don't have autoimmune centers all around the country where those high quality tests are being offered. You can't walk into a doctor's office and get that kind of testing. So often you're sick for quite a while before tests show it. And again, the advent of germ theory, the advent of evidence-based medicine means measurement leads the way. And patient's testimony is less valuable. Whereas in a kind of older model of medicine, it might be said, you don't treat the disease, you treat the patient, right? So I think this is a long answer to your question, but it's a way of explaining that the system is failing doctors as well as patients, doctors who want to offer an ethic of care. And I think it means too that as patients, we need to keep looking for that doctor who, for whatever reason, has that bandwidth and empathy to say, I see you and I hear you, in effect. And I had one such neurologist who, early on just looked at me and said, I can see that you are suffering. And she said, and you are not the only patient who has come and described the particular symptoms that I was having. She said, I don't know what they are. I don't know what causes them. I'm going to put you, if you'd like, I would be happy to put you in a research trial. She's like, it's not going to help you, but maybe it will help others. And it just, I think to this day, she doesn't know how profound that was, that she looked at me and said, I see that you're suffering, and how much I clung to that one bit of being seen for years. Yeah, for years. Yeah. So look for, I ended up turning to integrative medicine, which was very helpful for me. But interestingly, that neurologist and a bunch of my other best doctors ended up moving to private practices where they stopped taking insurance. And they did that not because they're money grubbing, but because they wanted to be able to spend time with their patients. And the 15-minute appointment just would not allow them to do that.
Yeah. And that ties into, I think, you have this quote from the book, the sick body is always in dialogue with others. And so what you said about, being able to treat a patient not just an individualized illness, also the fact that this neurologist said, I can't help you, but this could maybe help others. So there's this emphasis on, I think, community and care in your book. And there's also this quote in the introduction that I earmarked. Indeed, this book is about living with, rather than eradicating or defeating, a disease. A story about letting go of the American ethos of overcoming and about confronting our mutual interdependence. I love that idea. I love the idea of, illness as a community thing, which I think has become even more present recently with COVID and the fact that it required a community response that we weren't always able to do. But I was thinking about community and about care and wondering about, any not strictly medicinal examples of care, either from within or without the medical system, that you were able to find or that exist.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you read that quote, because I think this was it's so obvious in retrospect, and remember too that I got sick when I was very young. But maybe this is part of the wisdom that comes with aging. But I look back and I just think, wow, I thought I had to solve this all myself. And I also thought that the illness was something that, it was really challenging for me. I felt I couldn't do what my peers were doing. I felt weaker than they were. I felt like a failure at various points. And I think it was just it really was almost dying that led me to realize that, none of us is responsible alone for our own illness. And in fact, what I was finding on message boards and in community groups that I joined, which were these models of care, right? I ended up joining a lot of patient groups and sort of lurking in different communities, and then finding, by the way, other artists and writers who were sick, and we became a kind of support group for one another. And those people really got me through some dark times and through writing this book. And it was through that and reading other people's kind of anguished testimonies on Facebook or in MySpace, wherever we were, realizing that all of us were telling ourselves the same story, that somehow it was our fault that we were sick. And autoimmune diseases have the word self built into them. The word auto comes from the Latin for self, which I knew. My dad was a classicist, so and there's this idea that I saw this over and over, that your own immune system, which is supposed to be your defender, it's your personal protector, was turning on you. And over I saw people, men and women, saying, I must have done something wrong to make my immune system attack my own body. I must be living an inauthentic life. And it's a very powerful story to tell, because we all have things in our lives that feel inauthentic. And indeed, because autoimmune diseases may also be triggered by chemicals and aspects of modernity, there was this way in which moving to this narrative of something about my modern life is inauthentic and I have to retreat. My marriage isn't good, or I'm in the wrong job. But the more I thought about it, the more this made no sense to me. Because cancer is also a disease of the immune system gone awry, right? Your immune system doesn't keep cells in check that are supposed to be killed, and so they multiply. But we don't anymore, at least, tell ourselves a story that if you have cancer, you did something wrong in your life, right? So I began to realize this was a false story. And to realize that we needed a new story, which was that these diseases, the rise in autoimmune disease, the rise in some of these poorly understood immune-mediated diseases, probably are triggered by changes in environment, chemicals, microbiome, the community of organisms in our gut, and that actually it really is a social story. And to your question about where did I find care and support, as I realized that and began thinking about it, I started talking to scientists. And I realized that in the world of science, they're ahead of us. They're ahead of the medical system. They're thinking about this, they're doing it. So I actually personally found incredible support and just excitement in the idea that, science is on it. Mm-hmm. They're on it. There's gonna be a radical change in our understanding of these illnesses. Mm-hmm. We're not there yet. And then more personally in these online support groups and through meeting incredible other people who were living with illness and realizing that I too had internalized this idea that, sick people were just maybe not trying hard. It's like through being myself sick and meeting other sick people, realizing how much I had my own biases as a young person anyway. But yes, it really has been this community of other people who are living with illness and trying to make things and survive. And maybe the thing you're making is your family. Maybe the thing you're making is a friendship. But just being in that community and being moved by how hard everyone in that community works just to survive. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love this idea of solace being found in science. The idea that kind of the health of the planet, you could even say, is reflected in the health of the body, the health of the community reflected in the body. I love that, even like looking at the cover, the way that the nerves seem to come off the body and connect to other things. That concludes the questions that I have, but sorry, that was more of a comment, really. But I wanted to open it to questions from the audience. So if anyone has anything that they're curious about, you can ask a question, and then I will repeat it so that everyone can hear it, and then pass it off to you. So feel free to call on whoever.
I think there's a hand right here. Yeah.
So I won't scream. I'll just
and then I'll repeat it.
So as someone who suffered from long-term chronic illness, John Sarno's work has been very helpful, and Nicole Sachs' work as well. Wondering how that's informed your work. And then the second question that I struggle with is, how do you talk yourself off the ledge of fear when you have that morning and you wake up and you think, is this today, and how am I going to get on the plane to go to the talk? How will I get through this day? And yet you're just close, but you're not there. So how do you talk yourself off that ledge?
Thank you for that question.
So we had two questions. It was, can you say the names once more? The work of Nicole Sachs and John Sarno as well, and then also talking oneself off the ledge of fear, how to wake up and how to meet the day when living with a chronic illness like that.
Such important questions. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sorry about your chronic illness. Sarno, so for those of you who don't know, John Sarno was a physician who dealt with back pain and kind of had this insight that many people who are dealing with severe muscle pain, ligament pain like carpal tunnel, back pain, that he could help them by encouraging them to come into contact with sort of repressed feelings and emotions that they had, rage, frustration, whatever it might be. And by doing a sort of series of therapies, including journaling and identifying the repressed anger or frustration, I'm probably slightly garbling this, but basically this idea that, that our emotions impact our health, which is clearly true. I tried Sarno's therapies and worked with a Sarno PT. It did nothing for me. Basically, it helped a little bit. But I think what was going on with me personally was so much more than, I do have a lot of joint pain from this condition I have called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but it was really, in my case, the tick-borne illness that was making me so sick that pretty much nothing could touch it around the edges. And I think as a consequence that so many people were telling me to try John Sarno, and then looked at me suspiciously when I said Sarno didn't work. Clearly thinking, I didn't want to be well. That I got, I'm not suspicious of Sarno. I talk about him in the book, but I do try to make the case that although emotions play a role in illness, and stress certainly, clearly, scientifically can exacerbate certain kinds of immune-mediated illness. Often they're not the sole cause of the illness, right? And that we put too much onto chronically ill people when we ask them again to be the people solving their own illness through identifying all their emotional repression, right? So that I see Sarno, in other words, as an important tool in a large toolbox that goes beyond him, right? That we do need to identify like our own hypervigilant habits of stress, or, in my case, like I worked really hard, I never slept, I had to really reimagine how I lived my life and acknowledge that I was like constantly putting myself in super stressful situations that weren't helping my health, and I had to change that as part of my life hacks. So I see that as a tool, but my concern is that a lot of healthy people kind of want to see Sarno, or that idea that, like, if you identify your emotions as the sole solution, right? Because again, it takes the burden off them, having to recognize that, like, well, maybe it's all the chemicals we're putting in our environment that are also making people sick, or the spread of tick-borne illness through climate change. There are these other things that we also need to talk about. The question of fear, I mean, I read a passage last night that was exactly about this. It's so hard. I had a really incredible medical psychologist. I saw a medical psychiatrist when I was pregnant with my son because of my autoimmune disease. I had a very high risk of stillbirth in the 3rd trimester. And they said something that I now share all the time. And first of all, I recommend seeing medical psychiatrists who specialize in chronic illness. But she said, you have to tell yourself that you're just going to think about today and the last piece of medical information you have. And you're not going to project into the future. You're just going to go on what is right there with you. And you're going to remember that you have the best possible care you can have, and you know what the problem is, right? Which has been very helpful to me, that, like, now at least I know what my diagnosis is. I do have doctors who can help me, but I have no great answers to the fear because it's there every day, right? Especially if you wake up feeling sick. I recently had a bad flare, and immediately I thought, okay, is this it? Am I just going back down into that chasm? And I had no answer until I just went through it, right? So it's really hard. I think finding people in community who you can talk to who get it is really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question? A hand there and a hand here, yeah.
To follow up on that, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have a client I've been seeing for about a year now who has a similar condition. And I was going to ask, what have you heard from a therapist that has been most helpful? And also, often she will text me like half an hour before the session saying, I'm just too overwhelmed, I can't do the session. And I don't, I want to respect that. I don't want to push her to do that. But I'm just wondering what you think would be most helpful.
Yeah, that's a great question.
So this question was from a clinical psychologist, kind of asking, how to help patients who are feeling overwhelmed, who can't come and literally come to their appointments. What is the best type of help that can be offered in that situation?
Yeah, I think the first step is witness. I think the first step is that very basic act of I can see that you're really overwhelmed. This sounds really hard. And as a chronically ill person, you don't get that very much, because there's something about chronicity. If you think about it, we've all had a friend who's in crisis, we spring into action. But I never had that as a chronically ill person because I was just always sick, right? So I do think that from a therapist, that act of witness and just showing up and being present is such a gift in a way that must feel frustratingly small to you, but is probably actually enormous. I think the other thing is what I just said, that this therapist said, okay, we're going to take it chunk by chunk, go on. I think for me personally, it was just very comforting to think, right, I'm already in care. What I can do for myself is keep finding good caretakers, good people to help me. I can't control the illness, but I can control the help I have. And in terms of the canceling, I wonder, are the appointments by Zoom or are they in person?
No, they end up being by Zoom because she can hardly ever get there.
Yeah.
And I'm encouraging her to be in my group, my women's therapy group.
Mm-hmm.
But if she can't, commit to be there, and I think it would be really helpful. I don't wonder what you think about that.
Yeah. Maybe you can, because I think one thing that can be hard is that you don't know day to day if you are going to be well, and you do end up feeling like, oh my God, I'm going to let these people down. And energetically, I did find interacting with other people was exhausting. It just was, even as I needed it. And so I had internalized, well, maybe I'm just really introverted, which I'm a little introverted, but not that introverted. It was so tiring to pull together the mental focus. It really was. So I think maybe asking her, is it really tired? You know, how do you feel after the sessions? What is this like? I'm torn. You could just bring her into your uncertainty. I'm torn because I think this would be really helpful for you. I also wonder, is it exhausting for you, or is it are you worried about your inconsistency? Does that also add stress to it? And just letting her share. Yeah. And saying, I can see this is really tough, but the more we can work together, the more helpful I can be.
Yeah. And you don't think that really kind of giving her an extra little push would be the best thing, because it might really
I don't. Yeah. I think what can happen is that there is this cycle in which you might disappoint people, and you're not in control. So then you almost sort of take on proactively disappointing people. Right? Like I would almost already be like, no, I'm not going to be able to do that, because I was so worried about disappointing people, and then I was so frustrated, because frustration comes into this, right? That it would get very hard for other people to read what I was actually, or for me even to know what was going on, right? But I was constantly having to cancel things, which is very unlike me. But I think, while knowing that while saying, look, I want to help you and I want this, but I know commitment might be hard for you right now. I think that's what it is. It's the commitment that's quite hard. Yeah, and I think that's really, truly hard. I know there was a question behind.
We have time for one more question about this.
I don't know if this counts as the last one, but you mentioned in chapter 6 how many alternatives you use. So
yeah.
You mentioned all your doctors by names, but you don't really mention your acupuncturist and your massage therapist, who you say actually did help you.
Yeah.
And could help you with the pain when the morphine stopped working. Could you talk more about that?
Sure. So I actually only mentioned one doctor specifically by name. I sort of give the others, initials. And one of the reasons I don't mention the massage therapist, I had a lot of different massage therapists and acupuncturists, and it would just have been too complicated to kind of narratively go into them. But yeah, I was really helped personally by acupuncture and by massage therapy, and I am still in what's it called, physical therapy once or twice a week, because I have this genetic condition which I didn't know until I was finishing the book, called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which can mean that, in my case, means my connective tissue is made improperly, and it means that I'm just in pain all the time. And so those treatments and those people, and I think something like acupuncture, which is, in my case, was really, really helpful to helping my body rest. When I got really sick, I was in this kind of tired and wired cycle where I couldn't sleep properly. It's funny, I was just looking back at my old Fitbit, and I got a new one. I hadn't used it in years, and then it pulled up this time from when I was sick, and I was like, oh wow, I really was sick. Like, you can see it. Like, I was just not able to sleep. I wasn't in deep sleep. Anyway, so acupuncture was, I think, is a probably under-supported and underexplored resource for these immune-mediated illnesses. It's very hard to study acupuncture because the whole premise is that it is different for each person. But there are some really good studies, in my view, that suggest acupuncture is extremely helpful with immune system balancing. If parts of your immune system get off, I'm speaking a bit crudely, but it can be quite beneficial to the immune system and to the autonomic nervous system. And these are things that can get dysregulated after COVID, after a virus, after tick-borne illness. And so it was profoundly helpful to me. Didn't cure me, but it was funny. In the summers, when there's no viruses around and there's sunshine and good food, just acupuncture and these alternative therapies itself would be enough to kind of get me pretty well. And then basically, as soon as I got a virus, I would go downhill again. Yeah, I'm a big believer in acupuncture and massage therapy.
Just for the sake of time, we're going to end it there. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions.
I know that this is a deeply important topic and a deeply personal topic. So I just want to say thank you for coming to speak with us about, the problem writ large and also your own personal experience with it. Megan is here available to sign books. Please do consider supporting